So previously I watched the 1.5 hour video of the interview with Paul Bonacci by Gary Caradori. Now as I was going back to try to find, some of the videos I'd watched in the past and just kind of refresh my memory, I found that a lot of them have now been restricted, which I'm not really surprised about. So I'm going to just try to go off of memory on most of the details. I did find a little bit of new stuff, but a lot of this I've already looked into. So I'm going to just try to remember what I saw in the videos in previous years. So hopefully I don't jump around too much. I'm going to try to keep this organized. So Paul Bonacci lived in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, I wasn't clear on if he actually lived at Boys Town or if he was just taken to Boys Town to recruit. Boys Town is a Catholic-run home for children in the foster care system in Omaha. That was one of the things that he said he did. So he would just go out there and lure kids off of the campus, or just, I guess, recruit them, outright. It seems one of the big players in this, the person who would always take Paul to what they called, quote, bad parties, was this Larry King. Now, he was a credit union owner. So he ran the Franklin Credit Union. And now, according to Paul, this Larry King, Lawrence E. King, took Paul to, all different parts of the country. So some of these incidents occurred in Omaha, but there were others in Bohemian Grove, Washington, D.C., and there would be other children that would be there as well. Some of them were from the areas where they traveled. I know at least one boy, he said, that attended one of the parties was actually from Washington, D.C., and then there were other children that were transported there from Omaha, and again, I assume is from Boys Town. Another place that he said he went was the Bohemian Grove, which is, I believe it's outside of Sacramento. Now, at that location, apparently they were filming stuff that was definitely pornographic. Paul claims that a child was actually murdered on that occasion. And I think that's the only murder that he discusses. So at some point, a senator, John DeCane, from Nebraska, asked for it to be investigated. So finally, after come forward with the information about Johnny Gosh, and no one questioned him whatsoever. So a man named Gary Caradori was sent to interview Paul. Now, Paul is in jail. And here's kind of a weird thing. So as the case started to develop against Larry King, it was kind of two-pronged. So there was the investigation into the child trafficking. There was also an embezzlement case against him. So the FBI got involved, and I think maybe the CIA. And so the victims who had come forth, and there were 6, but I only recall 3, and that would be Paul Bonacci, Troy Boner, and Alicia Williams, I think was the girl's name. So they, provided the details about the murder at Bohemian Grove, about seeing one of the Bushes at one of their parties in the really wrong company with children. Senator Barney Frank, who is a Massachusetts Democrat, appointed to the House of Representatives. And no one supposedly believed the kids. Now, my take on it is obviously they wanted to sweep this under the rug because of the high profile, participants in these crimes. So ultimately, Larry King was charged with the embezzlement. But there were like 40 counts of child molestation that were all dropped. So the kids who had testified, the 3 that I mentioned, these poor kids were actually put in prison. Now, I know the girl was in there for 4 years, and I'm not sure about Paul and Troy off the top of my head, but, you know, there were a lot of high-powered people who were really not happy that this information was coming out. And I recall reading at some point that, and it seemed like it was a scare tactic, someone killed Troy Boner's brother. So, of course, you know, that's going to cause most people to back off the case and, you know, stop testifying. So it really seems like Paul was the interviews that you can find online. I'm not saying the other kids weren't interviewed. It's just that Paul is the one where the interviews used to be fully available online, and you could still find bits and pieces. The description of what happened at Bohemian Grove. The interview with Caradori is up there. So then another senator from Nebraska, Ernie Chambers, also started looking into the case. And he ultimately also came to the conclusion that it was unfounded. Now, I kind of got the distinct impression that, you know, something caused him to back off. My opinion is that it wasn't unfounded. It was just too big. So anyway, so Gary Caradori was sent to interview Paul Bonacci, and at some point, he and his son had flown in a personal plane to Chicago to see a baseball game. And on the way back, as they were flying over Ashland, Illinois, they had a plane crash. Now, there was some indication that there had been some sabotage involved, and I'll never be able to find out for sure one way or another. Anyway, so Paul Bonacci also describes a house kind of out in a rural area, I believe, of Colorado, where a number of children were held. And I believe he said that one of the children was Johnny Gosh. So he described the house. It's kind of a ranch style, and I guess underneath the house, you can pull these panels aside, and that's where the kids were actually kept, was under the house. And so that's where the pictures come in. The kids in the pictures have rope still hanging on them, like it's been untied, but it's still there in the photographs. It's just very, very disturbing. Now, Paul says that he was actually taken to Des Moines. I believe the information said they were going specifically for Johnny Gosh. Now, I didn't find anything that, specifically linked Paul and these other people to the Eugene Martin or the Mark Allen cases. But these happened in later years, and so maybe by that time Paul was, not involved anymore. It's kind of hard to say, but the cases are so similar that it just seems to me that there's very likely a connection of some sort. And somewhere years ago I read that there had been someone around town taking pictures of Johnny, and this would kind of be like a weird, twisted, advertisement for the sale of children. He says after they grabbed him, put him in the car, his job was to chloroform Johnny. And then I read somewhere that there was an abandoned, I think I watched a video, and I can't corroborate the source on this one because I don't even remember the source, but It said there was an abandoned barn outside of Des Moines that I believe it was Johnny was held for about 2 days before he was transported to Colorado. And so this kind of explains why the police officer in Des Moines didn't want anyone searching for Johnny because they might happen upon the barn. So there's just a lot of suspicion with that case. And it's also odd that in later years, as other boys were abducted from Des Moines, there are actually different police officers, and yet basically the same thing took place, where they, oh, he's a runaway, we're not going to search. So not saying that they necessarily, had the same level of supposed involvement as this Gene Lutz person. But it certainly seems suspicious, from any angle, why they're not taking these abductions seriously. Anyway, it seems that everyone besides the police who spoke with Paul Bonacci was convinced of the validity of his story, and I guess America's Most Wanted did a piece on him. And, were stunned, like anyone would be. But they said that, there's truth, and then there's prove it in court kind of truth. And unfortunately, they weren't able to come up with that type of proof. Now, one thing that I did notice is that Paul Bonacci referred to the person who owned the home as the Colonel. That would be the home in Colorado. And Unsolved Mysteries did find that there was a member of the police department that owned the house. So I don't know if he could have been a police chief, and they just referred to him as the Colonel. Now, the suspect in the Johnny Gosch case, according to Paul Bonacci, was a man named Emilio. And the family was able to get sketches of the supposed person. Now, this would be the one who drove the car. And no one ever found him, don't know his last name. Not clear on what other involvement he had in the situation other than, supposedly driving the vehicle. And then Paul refers to a, quote, little Italian guy who was present at the Bohemian Grove murder. So he says it was Larry King, the little Italian guy, the film producer, and a 4-person camera crew, and then him, another teenager, and a smaller child, which is the one that was murdered. So it just really is, a horrific story. There's another odd thing that Paul mentioned, kind of got my attention, and he said that they kind of used the molestation as a way to, brainwash the children, which sounds suspiciously like a military program that the United States ran. And it's called MK Ultra, and that was said to be, mind control achieved through extreme abuse, so that the children would develop different personalities so that they could be used as spies. And a lot of that information is now, been made a little more public. So you can find it online. Like, it's not hard at all. It was kept quiet for many years. Now they claim that they no longer run that program. So I'm just saying, I don't know. It's possible that they gave half the truth and said, oh yeah, we did, but we don't anymore. And again, there's no way to prove whether that's actually accurate or not. So at some point towards the end of this series, I will probably do a separate video on MK Ultra. Anyway, so Paul himself stated that he had, many different personalities, and he did work with a psychiatrist for, treatment of that. where he was able to reintegrate. But in the videos, I guess he changes personalities kind of back and forth. But the poor guy is just in tears as he's relaying the things that he was forced to do to the children. And that's actually a byproduct of his treatment, because a lot of the memories, I guess, had been suppressed. And so as he starts trying to reintegrate and pulling these things up to the surface and bringing them back to memory, I guess it was very difficult for him, which is understandable. But he just comes across as super genuine, super honest, and like I said, everyone besides the police, or the few police that actually talked to him, because most of them just never did, everyone else believed Paul Bonacci. So, now I do know that Johnny Gosch's mother absolutely believed Paul. And she said that at first she was, expecting to go in there and just have a lot of hatred and anger. But that isn't what she walked away with. She kind of recognized that he also was a victim. He started being coerced into participating in these things, probably, I'm guessing, around age 14, maybe even a little younger. Anyway, so another odd thing that I came across, that in some of Noreen Gosch's visits to prisons and different places, is that she would run into people who reported that they'd already met her, though she had not met them. And so the information that I came across was that Johnny's father actually hired a female private investigator who resembled his wife, or at least was able to effectively disguise herself to look like Noreen. And she didn't find this out until, obviously sometime later, and I think, I don't know, a couple years this was going on, maybe not quite that long. There's other information that I came across that suggested that he was somehow involved, so that could certainly add up with why he didn't want Noreen there, because she was, hardcore pit bull mom, investigating the case and keeping it going with the police and trying to get them to do what they were supposed to do. And so she could have been a real stumbling block if he's trying to hide information. Even though I can't necessarily verify some of these things, they do seem to fit well together. Anyway, so it's definitely a fascinating, although, tragic case to look into. And also one that you might want to, tread lightly on, because people turned up deceased. So, now in the next part, I'm going to look at another case that ties to the Richard Chaddick case, and this happened in Michigan. But anyway, so I'll go ahead and get part 4 on the Oakland County child killer case and try to, highlight some of the possible connections there. And as always, thanks for watching. Good night and God bless.